Gregg Roman is the Executive Director of Middle East Forum. He is a frequent commentator about Middle East affairs on both national and international news channels and studied national security and political communications at American University and Interdisciplinary Center in Herzliya. Sorry. Thank you. I now recognize Gregg Roman for his opening statement.
Madam Chairman, Ranking Member, and distinguished members of this committee, thank you for the opportunity to speak today. My name is Gregg Roman, Director of the Middle East Forum, and I'm here because there's a fox loose in the henhouse of our foreign aid system, a system intended to uplift lives abroad that instead has funneled millions of taxpayer dollars to radical and terrorist-linked organizations. If we don't fix these fences now, we risk fueling violence against our allies, our troops, and potentially ourselves. Let me be clear. This is a problem that began under the Obama administration and was exacerbated under the Biden administration. It's a problem that has been brewing across both of these 12 years of governance by a bureaucracy so insulated it can't always tell teachers from terrorists. The result is moral confusion among grant officers who unwittingly, and in some cases may intentionally, bankroll extremist causes. At the Middle East Forum for the last 12 years, we've engaged in oversight over all public spending relating to foreign aid, specifically those relating to Middle East and Islamist causes. And we have identified over $122 million, which has ended up supporting radical organizations or even directly bankrolling organizations which are considered to be terrorists by the U.S. government. That's not pocket change. That's a jackpot for the wrong crowd. In terms of our specific findings, World Vision. Over the past 2 decades, this major evangelical NGO has received nearly $2 billion from USAID. But in 2014, World Vision facilitated a $125,000 grant to the Islamic Relief Agency, an entity linked to Al-Qaeda. Even after a whistleblower raised red flags, USAID rammed through the funding, pressured by World Vision, Sudanese warlords, and even U.S. officials who lobbied to delist the terror organization. Helping Hand Relief and Development. In 2023, only 2 years ago, it received a $78,000 grant from USAID, despite openly working with the terrorists who orchestrated the 2008 Mumbai massacre in India. Worse, the offer and grant came after the USAID Inspector General launched an investigation into a prior grant to the same group. The Jamal Trust Bank in Lebanon. The USAID dollars helped pad the pockets of this financial institution, later designated by the U.S. Treasury Department as a terrorist sponsor for sponsoring Hezbollah. This was no mere oversight. It points to a broken system that handed cash to a future terror financing entity. Some graphical evidence. Behind me, you'll see the Bayadar and Unlimited Friends Association, 2 groups in Gaza. Members of the Gazan charity Bayadar cozy up to senior members of the Hamas Politburo, like Abdul Salam Haniyeh, the son of slaughtered Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh, credited as one of the planners of the October 7th attacks on Israel, which killed Israelis and American citizens. Meanwhile, UFA officials have called for their lands to be cleansed from the so-called, quote, impurity of the Jews. You'll see behind me 4 images which don't just show members of Bayadar and UFA associating with members of Hamas, but also USAID officials, employees of the U.S. government, receiving awards because of their cooperation with these 2 Hamas-linked entities. You even have a Facebook post from a few years ago, which is the USAID office in Jerusalem celebrating their relationship with a Hamas entity. I can't find anything more disgusting. And as the ranking member said, we're looking for evidence. This is not a conspiracy. This is a U.S. government communication. Lastly, masking the money trail. Billions of dollars in USAID grants are lumped under miscellaneous foreign awardees, making it impossible for Congress, the media, or the public to track who's really getting the funds. According to public testimony in another hearing in this Congress, a portion of this money has ended up in the hands of al-Qaeda affiliates in Syria. How does this happen? The oversight conducted by USAID is as weak as a house of cards in a windstorm, like handing out cash in a dark alley and hoping it doesn't buy trouble. USAID's vetting system is archaic, relying heavily on self-reported data with no real-time checks or teeth. Primary grantees are entrusted to vet their own subcontractors, even when those grantees themselves might sympathize with radical causes. In places like Gaza or Sudan, Groups with blatant extremist affiliations slip through because the so-called gatekeepers have no incentive or even an ideological desire to shut them out. This isn't a glitch. It's a feature of a broken system. And here's the kicker. It's a problem caused by bureaucrats now threatening American interests at home and abroad. It's not just about fraud, waste, and abuse. This is a threat to American national security and potentially criminal, and this committee should take action to ensure that the Department of Justice acts on it and does everything in Congress's power to not just investigate, but refer criminal actions to the proper authorities. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Roman.
So, Mr. Roman, to the issue at hand. How do we make sure when we get our foreign aid back running that we don't give money to terrorists? That's a great question.
So there's 4 recommendations that I would offer. The first is no more miscellaneous listings, as we had heard from the gentleman before. We have to use public vetting processes that require complete transparency, encourage independent audits, and mandate strict screening.
Why did we not have transparency before?
I have, for the last 18 months, been trying to get information about a grant made to what we believe is a Hamas affiliate, and the Freedom of Information Act Department, or the Freedom of Information Officer at USAID, has stonewalled me for the last year and a half. And this goes back all the way to 2015. It's as if
bureaucrats think they know better.
Bureaucrats think they know better.
Guess what? We're going to create transparency across all of government. And that is what President Trump is doing through Elon Musk. Elon Musk has been asked by the president to serve. And he is going to bring transparency not just to USAID, to every single nook and cranny of the government, because that is what the American people want. And it's 2025. We have the ability to do that. Mr. Roman, continue. What else can we do to make sure?
I'll go quick. I know we're limited. Stronger accountability mechanisms, clawback provisions, stiff penalties for misuse, criminal investigations if you go towards the terrorism financing. The State Department, under Secretary Rubio's review, must have a roadmap for better oversight. And lastly, the legislature must give teeth to its funding bills. We have to be able to have robust penalties, transparency mandates, and real-time oversight tools rather than waiting 3 years to get reports from contractors when they've already committed the violation past the statute of limitations.
I'm out of time. We all know sunlight is the best disinfectant, and that's the path forward. With that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
I now recognize the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Burchett, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Lady. Mr. Roman, are you aware that we are sending $40 million a week to the Taliban?
Yes, sir.
Can you name other instances of foreign aid going to terrorist organizations?
We have assisted al-Shabaab in Somalia. There's been instances of the Khamsi network in Sudan, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, Kataib al-Hezbollah, Hayat Tahrir al-Shams in Syria. Dozens of terror organizations have received indirect assistance from U.S. foreign aid.
Could you elaborate a little bit on the mechanisms in place that are to stop foreign aid from going to terrorist groups, and why are they not working if we have any in place?
Sure.
And I would note that these are, you notice, these are terrorist weaponry. You see some AKs, SKSs, some snipers, some clips, some clip carriers probably made in China, and I believe these are small landmines here beside right there.
Let's use Gaza as our case study. $2.1 billion in American taxpayers' money to Gaza since October 7th when Hamas invaded southern Israel. USAID money was going in terms of an emergency use authorization to try to go to parties that USAID formerly had a relationship with in the Gaza Strip. They had to have been vetted by OFAC. They should have been vetted against the special designated terror list from the State Department and from other Treasury organizations. Waivers were granted because they said that there was an emergency use to have that money come in to Gaza, thereby jettisoning the usual typical screening procedures. As a result, 90% of aid that was going from the United States by way of its agents in Gaza ended up in Hamas-controlled areas. And this is ridiculous. Essentially, what the U.S. assistance to Gaza did was underwrite the ability for Hamas to survive until the ceasefire was just passed a few weeks ago. There was no strategic thought for it, and there was no screening.
Seems like the emergency might have been armed terrorists to kill civilians. Would that be accurate?
That's accurate, and even more than that, Samantha Powers, the administrator for USAID, was intent on having Israel not be able to defend itself.
To not be able to defend it.
Correct.
How did terrorists exploit our foreign aid loopholes?
You have international NGOs and UN agencies actively lobby here in Washington, D.C. against vetting policies that would prevent it. I was the senior vetting officer at USAID, and what we did.
Did you say United Nations is doing this? The UN?
Sure, everybody who's getting money lobbies here.
That they're lobbying against us. I'm sorry, Mr. Roman.
There's actually someone who used to work for one of those lobbies, the largest NGO lobby, Interaction. One of our co-witnesses here worked for them from 2018 to 2023. USAID effectively self-funds its own external private lobby that then goes back to Congress and asks for more money for USAID.
So the taxpayers fund this lobbyist who's working against American interests.
Correct.
Possibly killing our allies and possibly Americans.
They bring together groups in Washington that overseas work with groups that kill Americans.
Yeah, I don't need a flow chart to show that. I appreciate it. Are we being lobbied by these pro-communist China groups currently?
Well, a lot of these countries don't even have to lobby because they get the money anyway, like South Africa.
Yeah, and in fact, these lobbyists have come to the House and have tried to kill legislation like H.R. 160, which was meant to increase transparency in USAID's funding of overseas organizations.
Is that a current piece of legislation?
That's from the last session.
And give me that number again.
H.R. 160.
And what does it do?
It was meant to give U.S. lawmakers the ability to have higher transparency in terror financing investigations aimed at scrutinizing extremist groups.
And if I can speak to that for a moment, what would you say are the main deficiencies in USAID's vetting and oversight process that has led to this waste, fraud, and abuse?
It's an aid industrial complex that refuses to have accountability and oversight.
And Mr. Roman, if I could ask you just to expand upon that.
Sure. I'll give you an example of the Together Project in civic space. Islamist organizations which work with designated terror organizations in different Middle Eastern countries and territories came under attack by our organization, the Middle East Forum, back in 2017. They put together a lobby which acted as an umbrella to go to Congress to say, ignore that organization that's exposing public data about money going to radical organizations. They're so-called, quote-unquote, Islamophobic. So by using politically charged language, they try to cover up their associations with terror organizations. Then they went back to USAID, said, look, Congress is going to fund us now because we lobbied for successful bills, and they got more money.
And what steps would you say, Mr. Roman, are needed to be taken to ensure grant recipients follow the rules and cooperate with the policies in place?
I think there's a gap in vetting and enforcement, allowing funds to move both directly and indirectly to extremist-linked groups. You have to have a pipeline where all the money that's coming out of U.S. government coffers is traceable exactly to which organization and subgrantee it goes to. And then once, if you have $1 touch one individual, that individual or that organization has to report back to be compared against U.S. vetting databases before a check is cut to them.
And if I can just ask, we'll go back to Mr. Roman. I really appreciated that example. With what time I have left, could you offer any other examples of mechanisms by which entities evaded transparency requirements, something that we all talk about and we've all seen the egregious spending across the board that's been illuminated by many members of this committee over the last 2 weeks. But when it comes to evading some of these requirements, I want to speak directly to that and enter that into the record to the extent you could share.
There's a bifurcation of the problem. One is the organizations which are abusing U.S. taxpayer dollars, but the second is the bureaucrats who are allowing them to get away with it. Sometimes because they're not looking and being blind to the issue. Other times because they're intentionally pursuing an ideological agenda that Congress didn't appropriate or authorize. You have to direct funding to have individuals that are getting money to be able to authorize that money, and the reports on the grants that they make after the funding period is over should also be publicly available rather than just how much money was spent. In addition to that, there is many other individuals and partnerships that go beyond USAID. For instance, foundations supporting extremists, persistent lapses in sanctions enforcement, and also potential violations of U.S. criminal statutes. The report that we put out suggests that funding streams may have contravened laws prohibiting material support to terrorism, sanctions violations, fraud, and false statements, both by the grantees and some of the grantors.